For most of your life, watering the garden has meant standing over it with a hose. Water falls from above. It lands on the surface, and you trust that somewhere down below, the roots are getting their drink. Here is the quiet trouble with that. On a hot afternoon in July, most of the water you pour on the surface is gone before supper. Some of it lifts straight back into the air as steam off the warm crust. Some of it slides sideways off the hard-baked top and never soaks in at all. And the rest, on sandy ground, races down past the roots so fast that by the time you coil the hose, it is already too deep for any plant to reach. You did not do anything wrong. You watered the way we were all taught. But you were watering the wrong direction. Because the gardeners who fed their families straight through the Depression, on well water and rain barrels and not much else, they knew something we have quietly forgotten. They did not try to push water down to the roots from the top. They built ground that held the water below and let it rise up to the roots on its own. No hose, no timer, no standing out there twice a day in the heat. They just called it good dirt. Today, soil scientists have a better name for it. They call it the soil sponge. And by the end of our little visit today, you are going to know exactly how to build one. Let us sit with why the hose keeps losing, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When you water from above, you are fighting gravity the whole time. Gravity wants to pull that water straight down and out the bottom. So the water arrives at the surface, passes through the root zone for a few hours, and keeps right on going. The top few inches get wet, then dry out. Then you wet them again. Wet, dry, wet, dry. Plants feel that swing. When the surface is the only place that is ever wet, roots stay shallow and crowd near the top, chasing it. And shallow roots are nervous roots. They dry out fast, they scorch in a heat wave, and they leave you tied to the hose every single evening. Now, here is the part I most want you to hear. If that has been your summer, year after year, it was never a failing on your part. You were handed the wrong tool and told it was the only one. Walk down any garden aisle. What is for sale? Hoses, sprinklers, timers, bag after bag of feed. All of it good business, because all of it gets used up, wears out, and gets bought again next spring. But the thing that actually fixes this, a soil that holds its own water, you cannot buy in a bag. You cannot patent it. You cannot sell it back to a gardener every April. It costs almost nothing, which, in an industry built on the next purchase, is the one thing it is never allowed to be. Nobody hid this from you on purpose. The market simply never had a reason to keep reminding you it exists. So let us remind ourselves. Let us build the very thing they cannot sell you. Start with the picture, because the picture does most of the work. Take an ordinary kitchen sponge and hold it under the tap. It drinks the water in and holds on to it. Set it on the counter and it stays damp for hours. Squeeze one corner and water moves through it to where you are pulling. That is almost exactly what healthy soil does with rain. And this is not garden folklore talk. Didi Pershaus, who founded the Land and Leadership Initiative and stood up at the United Nations on World Soil Day to explain it, calls living soil the soil sponge. Our own Department of Agriculture uses the very same word. Their soil scientists call healthy groundwater in the bank because it catches the rain when it falls and saves it for the dry weeks when you need it. There is a little test Pershaus likes, and you can do it on your own kitchen table tonight. Put a spoonful of plain flour on a plate, and next to it, a piece of bread. Now drip a little water on each. On the flour, the water beads up and runs off the side, carrying the flour with it. That is bare, lifeless dirt in a rainstorm. The bread, though, soaks the water right in and stays soft and whole. That is living soil. Same water, completely different ground. So what makes the difference between the flour and the bread? Two things, and you are going to build them both. First, the tiny spaces, the pores, that hold water in place against gravity instead of letting it drain away. And second, a gentle little piece of physics that carries that stored water back up to the roots when they get thirsty. Let me show you that piece of physics next, because it is the part almost nobody explains, and it is the part that changes everything. Here is a thing water does that most of us were never told. Under the right conditions, water climbs. It moves upward, against gravity, all on its own. And you have watched it happen your whole life. Dip one corner of a paper towel in a glass of water, and the wet line creeps up the towel. Rest a dry lamp wick in oil, and the oil rises to the flame. Set a sugar cube on a wet spoon and watch the dark line climb up through it. That is the whole secret, right there on the kitchen table. Scientists call it capillary action. It works because water is a little bit sticky, in two ways at once. Water clings to any surface it touches, and water clings to itself. So inside a very narrow channel, the water grabs the walls and pulls itself upward, and the rest of the column follows along behind it, like a chain. And here is the key that makes this useful in a garden. The narrower the channel, the higher the water climbs. In a channel about the width of a coffee stirrer, water lifts itself only a little over an inch. But narrow that channel down to the width of a single human hair, and the same water climbs nearly a foot, straight up, with no pump and no power at all. In the fine, crumb-sized pores of rich, living soil, that upward reach can go higher still. Now let me be honest with you, the honest way, because it matters. It is the tiny pores that lift water up. The big, open holes do the opposite. They drain fast and dry out. So when somebody tells you a big fat worm tunnel wicks water up to the roots, that is only half the story. And we will set it straight in a few minutes. What actually lifts water to a thirsty root is the fine, spongy structure you build with organic matter. Build those fine pores, and your soil starts watering itself from below. Skip them, and no gadget on the shelf will ever do it for you. So that is the whole idea, and it is beautifully simple. Deep down, a reservoir that holds the water, and fine pores that carry it upward to the roots as they dry. Everything left for us to do is learn to build both, and none of it costs anywhere near what you would think. Before we start building, one small thing. Everything we are about to cover, the layers of the sponge, the seasonal timing, and an honest look at what year 1 through year 3 really looks like, I have gathered onto a single page you can print and tape inside the shed door. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours to keep. No charge and nothing to sign up for. Then stay right here with me, because the first layer is the one that outlasts all the others, and almost nobody thinks to start there. If you build only one thing this year, build this one. It is the least glamorous and the most important, and it goes by a plain old name: humus. Humus is what is left after leaves and roots and compost have finished breaking down all the way, past the crumbly stage, into a dark, stable, spongy material that can sit in your soil for decades. And here is why it earns the top of the list. The Noble Research Institute, which has studied soil and grazing land for generations, puts it plainly. Organic matter behaves like a sponge, holding up to 90% of its own weight in water, and, better still, it gives most of that water back to the plant. Clay can hold a lot of water too, but clay clamps down and will not share. Humus holds it loosely and hands it right over. Let me give you one number that stopped me in my tracks. Dr. Michelle Wander, a soil science professor at the University of Illinois, sat down and worked through the math on this. Raise the organic matter in your soil by just 1%, and an acre of that soil can hold somewhere between 16 and 20,000 more gallons of water. 1%. Now, the honest footnote, and Dr. Wander is the very first to give it. That number leans on a few assumptions, so treat it as the shape of the truth, not a promise to the gallon. But the direction is rock solid, and every soil scientist agrees on it. More organic matter means more water held, every single time. So why does it work? Humus is riddled with those fine pores we just talked about, so it grabs water and lifts it. How do you build it? The free way. Stop hauling your leaves and your spent plants out to the curb. Let them break down on the bed instead. Add compost. Pile on shredded leaves in the fall, what the old-timers called leaf mold. Every handful that rots down deepens the sponge. And the one mistake to avoid: do not dig it all in and churn the bed every year. Every time you turn the soil hard, you burn through your humus and shatter the very pores you are trying to build. Here, the gentlest gardener wins. And unlike a bag of anything, humus does not wash out by August. Once it is there, it stays for years. It is the one water improvement you make once, and then simply keep. Now let us go deeper, literally, and build the big tank. There is an old European method with a mouthful of a name: Hugelkultur. It just means a bed built up over buried wood. You dig out a bed, you lay logs and branches down in the bottom, you cover them back over with soil and compost, and you plant right on top. As the wood slowly rots underground, it turns into a giant, spongy reservoir that soaks up the rain and holds it for months. The best-known name here is Sepp Holzer, an Austrian farmer who built whole terraces of these mounds high up in the Alps, on steep, stony ground where most everyone said nothing would ever grow, and he raised fruit and vegetables with almost no watering at all. A well-built wood bed can keep on giving for 20 years as those logs break down. Why it works. Fresh wood actually resists water at first, but as fungi begin to soften it, the wood opens up inside and starts to drink like a sponge, more and more each year. That buried water then rises up toward the roots on the dry days, through the very same capillary action we just talked about. How to do it? Dig down about 1.5 to 2 feet. Lay in your logs and branches. Hardwoods like oak, maple, and old apple are best, because they rot slowly and hold water the longest. Cover them with a few inches of smaller twigs, then a layer of compost, then your soil back on top. And here is a tip most folks miss. Soak that wood well when you build, right then and there, with the hose. A dry log takes a long time to start drinking, so charge the sponge on day 1. Now, 3 honest cautions, because I would never send you into this blind. First, never use black walnut. Its wood carries a natural chemical called juglone that is poison to tomatoes and a good many other vegetables. When in doubt, leave the walnut out. Second, in that very first year, the fresh wood borrows nitrogen from the soil as it starts to rot, so young plants up top can look a little pale and hungry. Give them a bit of extra compost or feed that first season, and by year 2, the wood begins paying it all back. And third, if your yard runs on a slope, keep these mounds modest and well covered, so a hard, driving rain cannot wash the pile downhill. And one more, gardener to gardener. This one is real digging. If your back and your knees have earned their rest, you do not have to move a mountain. Build a small one, or use the lazy version the old farmers loved. When a tree comes down, build your mound right on top of the old stump and let it rot in place. Half the work, all the reward. Let somebody younger swing the shovel and take the credit. We will know who did the real thinking. The next layer is far smaller than a log, but it works on the very same principle, and it may just outlast anything else you ever put in the ground. It is called biochar. Biochar is a special kind of charcoal, made by cooking wood or plant matter with very little air, so that instead of burning away to ash, it chars down into nearly pure carbon. And if you looked at a single crumb of it under a strong microscope, you would see it is honeycombed with millions of tiny pores. Every one of those pores is a little cup that holds water and nutrients right there in the root zone. The good folks at the University of Florida have studied this closely, because so much of their state is sandy soil that water pours straight through like a sieve. What they found is that working biochar into sandy ground, together with compost, helps it hold noticeably more water and lose far less to leaching down below the roots. For soil that used to drain like a colander, that is the difference between watering every day and watering every few days. Why it works. All those microscopic pores are exactly the narrow little spaces that hold water against gravity and lift it back up. How to use it. Mix it into your compost or your beds, and a little goes a long way. And the one mistake to avoid, and this one is important, never dig in fresh, raw biochar all by itself. Straight out of the bag, it is thirsty and empty, and it will actually rob water and nutrients from your plants for a whole season while it fills itself up. So charge it first. Let it sit and soak in your compost pile, or a bucket of compost tea, for a couple of weeks before it ever goes in the ground. Charged biochar feeds your plants. Raw biochar steals from them. Same material, all in the timing. Here is a method so simple it feels like cheating, and it sets the water down exactly where the plant will go looking for it. Instead of spreading every bit of your compost on the surface, bury some of it deep, down at root level, right where the next plant is going in. Dig your planting hole a little deeper than usual. Drop a couple of good handfuls of compost or well-rotted scraps into the bottom. Cover that with an inch of soil, and set your transplant on top. Why it works. That buried pocket becomes a little wet sponge sitting right underneath the plant. The roots find it, dive straight down toward it, and anchor there, down deep, where the soil stays cool and damp long after the surface has baked bone dry. From then on, water rises up out of that pocket into the root ball, day after day, and stretches out the time between waterings. How to do it across a whole bed. Sink these pockets about 1 foot to 1.5 feet apart, and their damp zones overlap into one moist layer running under the entire bed. That old kitchen garden trick of burying your food scraps right in the row, the one some of you learned at a grandmother's elbow, was never only about feeding the soil. It was quietly building these little reservoirs all along. She may not have called it capillary action. She just knew that row never dried out the way the others did. The mistake to avoid: do not bury raw, chunky kitchen scraps right up against tender young roots, and do not do it where it will draw digging critters to your bed. Well-rotted compost, set a hand's width below the roots, is the safe and steady way. Everything so far has been about structure: the pores, the wood, the char, the pockets. But a sponge on its own just sits there. What turns your soil into a living, self-watering system is the crew that moves in and goes to work. And the best part is, they all work for free. Start with the earthworms. When rain or a deep watering comes down, an earthworm's burrow acts like an open drain pipe, carrying that water down fast, past the hard surface, straight to the reservoir waiting below. Our Department of Agriculture describes healthy soil doing exactly this. Worms and roots open the channels, and the rain flows in and gets stored. Now, this is the honest correction I promised you a little while back. The big worm tunnels do not wick water up. They let water in. And then the fine, spongy structure the worms leave behind, all those rich castings, all that lovely crumb, that is what holds the water and lifts it back up to the roots, down through the tunnels, held in the crumb, up through the fine pores. In one study, certain earthworms raised the soil's water-holding capacity by somewhere between 7 and 16%, just by living there and doing what worms do. Then there is the quieter partner underground, the fungi. Fine white threads of fungus, called mycorrhizae, weave themselves right onto the plant's roots and reach far out into the soil, well past where the roots alone could ever go. For the longest time we assumed they only carried food, but it turns out they carry water too. In one careful greenhouse experiment, researchers used specially tagged water to prove that these fungal threads ferried water across a gap that plant roots simply could not cross, and it added up to roughly a third of all the water those plants drank. A third. From a partner you will never see, working for nothing but a small share of the plant's sugar. Now, the honest labeling, because you are going to hear this one oversold. You may have heard that these fungal networks lovingly send water to whichever plant needs it most, like some underground charity. The truth is gentler and simpler. Water moves through those threads from wetter ground toward drier ground, following plain physics, the same as it does everywhere else. Whether the network shares between different plants on purpose is still being worked out by honest scientists, the kind who will look you in the eye and tell you they do not fully know yet. And that is just fine. You do not need the fairy tale. The plain truth, that fungi help water your plants, is remarkable enough on its own. Your only job is to keep them alive, and you do that by not digging hard and not leaving the ground bare. Feed the soil, and this whole invisible crew shows up and works the night shift for you. Now, everything we have built so far is the long game. The wood, the humus, the char, they all get better every season, but they do ask for patience. So let me hand you something you can do this very weekend that waters from below starting the same day. And it is maybe the oldest trick in this whole video. It is called an Olla, spelled O-L-L-A, and said Olla. It is simply an unglazed clay pot, plain terracotta, the reddish kind, buried in the ground up to its neck, with the mouth left open above the soil. You fill it with water, cap the top, and walk away. Here is the beautiful part. Because the clay is unglazed, it is porous, and water seeps out through the clay walls only as fast as the surrounding soil is dry. When the ground is already moist, the seeping slows right down and stops on its own. It waters your plants exactly as much as they need, and not a single drop more. No timer ever made could do it better. The roots find the pot, wrap themselves gently around it, and drink straight from the source, underground, where the sun cannot steal a thing. And this is not some brand new invention. Colorado State University's Extension Office traces it back more than 4,000 years, to China and North Africa, and gardeners across the desert Southwest have leaned on it for generations. One good fill can last several days to a week, depending on your heat. How to do it, and cheaply. You can buy a purpose-made Olla, or you can make your own for a few dollars with 2 plain terracotta pots, glued rim to rim, with the drain hole in the bottom one plugged up. Bury it to the neck right next to your thirstiest plants, your tomatoes, your peppers, your squash, and just keep it topped up. And the honest cautions, from one careful gardener to another. Always keep a lid or a flat stone over that open mouth, so it does not turn into a birdbath for mosquitoes, and so no little one or curious pet ever finds an open hole in the ground. Mark where it is buried so you do not step on it. And if your winters bring a hard freeze, dig it up in the fall, or the water left inside will freeze and crack it. Treat it kindly, and a good Olla will serve you for years. It costs less than one nice dinner out, and it never sends you a bill again. So let us stack it all up now, from the very bottom of the bed to the top, so you can see the whole sponge in one clear picture. At the very bottom, a foot or two down, your buried wood, the big reservoir that holds water for months at a time. Above that, the finer stuff, your compost, your buried pockets, your charged biochar, filling in the gaps and adding the fine pores that lift water upward. Above that, your everyday garden soil, made richer and spongier every year with humus. And right on the very top, a blanket of mulch or a living cover to keep the sun from stealing the moisture back out. Rain comes down through the worm channels, gets caught and held in every single layer, and then rises back up to the roots on the dry days, all on its own. Now let me be honest with you about the timeline, because honesty is the whole point of this channel. This is not a bag you pour on for an overnight miracle. It is a garden that gets a little stronger every year you tend it. Year 1, you are building. You will still water fairly often, especially over any fresh buried wood while it borrows its nitrogen. Do not lose heart. This is the year you lay the foundation. Year 2, you will start to feel it turn. The wood is drinking now. The humus is deepening. The worms have moved in. You will notice you are reaching for the hose a little less, and your beds are staying damp a day or two longer after each good rain. And by year 3 and beyond, the sponge is really working for you. A great many gardeners on ground like this find they only need to water during the long dry spells, while their garden sails right through a heat wave that leaves the neighbors cracked and gasping. The forest took centuries to build its sponge. You can build yours in about 3 years, because you are adding the very same things the forest adds: the leaves, the wood, the life, and the quiet, just faster and on purpose. Now, if any of this feels like a great deal to take on, let me lift that weight right off your shoulders. You do not do all of it, and you certainly do not do it all at once. You pick one thing in one bed, and you simply begin. If you have got a downed limb or a brush pile, bury a little wood under your next new bed. If you have got a bag of compost, sink a pocket of it under your tomatoes this spring. And if you cannot dig at all, and plenty of us have surely earned that right, then do not dig. Just stop taking the leaves away. Let them lie and rot right where they fall, and set an Olla in the ground beside your favorite plant. That alone, leaves resting on top and a clay pot quietly working below, starts your sponge without one single shovelful of hard labor. That is the quiet magic of this whole thing. It compounds. Every leaf you leave, every scrap you bury, every season you do not churn it all up, the soil holds its water a little longer than the year before. You are not starting over. You are picking up something your grandparents' generation knew in their hands, and simply choosing, this year, to feed the ground instead of the plant. I want to leave you with a picture. I think of a hot, cracked afternoon in August, the kind of day where the whole garden looks tired and the ground pulls away from itself in dry seams. And I think of kneeling down at a bed I had been tending the slow way for a few years and pushing 2 fingers past the mulch down into the soil underneath, and finding it cool and damp and alive, while the air above it shimmered with heat. I had not put that water there that morning. I had not watered in over a week. The ground had simply kept it for me, down low, the way a good sponge does, and handed it back up to the roots while I slept, and while I worked, and while I forgot all about it. That is the moment you are building toward. The moment your garden stops needing you to stand over it, and starts, quietly, taking care of its own. That is the way the old gardeners grew. On the ground itself, and not on whatever came in a bag. It was never really about the water at all. It was about learning to trust the soil to do what soil has done, all on its own, for far longer than any of us have been here to watch it. If that is the kind of gardener you already are, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you belong right here with us. Subscribe, and let us keep tending the old, honest way, together, 1 square foot of living ground at a time.